This and all talks at the 2019 JavaScript for WordPress Conference are brought to you in part by our sponsors Pantheon, a high-performance hosting platform with agile developer tools. Check them out at pantheon.io.
Hey everybody, we are back for our third session of the day here in the JavaScript track for the JavaScript for WordPress Conference. And we have someone that I know is sure to be a treat because she is an amazing designer, an amazing presenter that I've seen before. Michelle Schulp is speaking to us about design for interactions. Now, Michelle is a digital designer and front-end WordPress theme developer in Minneapolis. When she isn't doing client service or contract work, she speaks, volunteers, organizes, and teaches at events around the country. Without further ado, I'm going to pass this on to Michelle.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to make technology work and do some screen sharing things so that we can all look at all these awesome slides. All right, then I will get started on the presentation. So yeah, this is designing for interaction using animation to enhance user experience. And we're going to be talking a little bit about some JavaScript specific stuff, but we're also going to be going into kind of some higher level philosophy about interaction and animation in general and kind of why we should be thinking about it. But it fits really well with everything that's going on in this conference because, you know, not just about like the tools we're using, but why are we using these tools in the first place, right? So that makes sense. So again, I already was introduced, but hi, I'm Michelle. I design and build digital interfaces. My background is in design, although most of my days nowadays are spent doing front-end development and strategy-focused user experience. But my first freelance job ever, while I was still in college, was actually doing banner and header animations in Flash for Career Builder. So that definitely dates when that was happening. But I've been doing animation-related stuff for the web basically since the beginning of my career. So it's kind of fun to be able to revisit that again now. But what we're here for at this moment is to talk about designing for interactions. And the reason that we're talking about this is because the web is built on interactions, right? I mean, the entire point of it is that it's a two-way conversation that the user can interact with your site. Native in HTML elements like links, buttons, forms, controllers, menus, all of these things are interactive. And nowadays, we even have a whole lot more fancy things like drag and drops and moving and hovering and grouping and stacking. We do a whole lot of things where we are interacting with these web applications. So the entire web is built on that interactions. But the other downside is that the web is built also on cutscenes. A whole lot of the web, like when you reload a page, everything kind of just reloads and you have no idea what's happening, right? And so the problem is that there's no real transition. There's an immediate change. And that causes a lot of problems cognitively. You have a lack of orientation. There's this thing where your brain basically internally resets everything as soon as a page loads. And there's also the problem of change blindness, where if it isn't obvious what's changed, it's kind of hard to tell. So this is like a really kind of extreme example of jumping between a couple of pages, but it's very, very jarring. And so what we need to do is be able to communicate that an interaction has happened, that something has changed, that it is successful, and not disorient or confuse our users. So what are some ways that we can do that? The first way in terms of design is just making sure that you are being consistent between your pages in your elements. So that's why we have consistent structure between our pages, keeping our menus in the same spot, following a lot of global patterns like what goes in a header, what goes in a footer, where does your content flow, etc. But the other thing that we can do, besides just making sure that we're consistent so people don't get disoriented, is use animation in order to make sure people know that their interactions were successful or working. So what exactly does animation do for interaction? There's a ton of things, and I've got a bunch of examples here. One thing that animation does is it provides context via hierarchy. So we're basically establishing hierarchical and spatial relationships between objects on a page. So we're demonstrating how we are navigating between layers, and we are also directing attention to important elements. So there's a really great example here showing how things are related to each other and giving us a little bit of a sense of depth. It also gives us context in terms of the relationship between content. So tab to tab or scroll and swiping is a really great example. These are basically adjacent or peer-to-peer relationships, content that is in the same level as each other. Another great example is a menu button to a drop-down, or a modal or a popover to a main element. We basically know where something is originating from. When something is like a parent-child relationship, so maybe taking a small line item and bringing it up to full screen. Things like toggles or accordions or drop-downs when something is expanding from a smaller element, or even if something is loading and we put like placeholder content in until the final content shows up, that's basically a replacement relationship. So there's several relationships that we can establish using interaction and animation. We can also use animation to provide feedback to indicate that, yes, we did receive your user action. So like I said, stuff like drag and drop or selecting or moving or hovering, we can use animation to provide feedback that these things were successful or completed. We can also use animation to indicate success or error states to make it very, very clear that something either did or did not work. We can use animation to indicate status. So basically, these are great for loading new content like placeholders or loading more content like through Ajax. We can use it to indicate state changes, such as toggling on or off, open or closed, selected or deselected, focused or unfocused, enabled or disabled, etc. We can use animation to indicate progress, so something like a loading bar or pagination. And we can use it to indicate function, indicate that something is working or where something is. Animation is also very useful in giving instruction. So we can use it to show how something works or where something goes. We can use it to make little instructional pop-ups or little modals. We can highlight where a starting element is, or we can even use it to build a full walkthrough of an application or of a website if there's something complicated going on. And of course, we can use animation to add delight. I mean, this is something that I find fun, and it's very, very subjective, but that's one of the things that you can use it to add delight, add personality and character, whether that's through small micro interactions that are a little bit more detailed, whether that's through creating full character animations, or even making entire B-roll or cutscenes. These are all just some really fun examples of just using a little bit of animation to make something a little more fun. The loading indicator especially just makes me laugh when it's like loading and then it just gets very sad. Oh man, that just cracks me up every time. But anyway, we've been using animation to indicate reception of user interaction since the very beginning. And the first example is in the very earliest computer interactions, the flashing cursor. This animation actually tells us a whole lot of information. First of all, like I said, it provides context via hierarchy by telling you this is the element on the screen to focus on. This is the most important thing on the page. It provides user feedback. If the cursor is moving as you're typing, that is a reception of action. Your typing is working. If the cursor is still flashing, that means things are still working, because as soon as this cursor stops flashing, it's like, uh-oh, maybe the system is bogged down or something is frozen, something's not working. And it also provides instruction because it shows you here is where you need to type. So even just this little basic flashing cursor that we've been using since the beginning is using animation to tell a whole lot of information. So what I wanted to do first is go back and start at the very beginning, talk about what is animation, and the best way to do that is to talk about the 12 principles of animation, which was developed by the original animators at Disney Animation Studios. And it's also been published as a really great book called The Illusion of Life, which looks really, really impressive on any coffee table. I've got one myself. So if you want something to look super good or have some light brunch reading, I would highly recommend this book. But these principles were created very early in the days of animation to be able to provide a platform that makes animations feel more physically and psychologically believable. And what I'm going to go is go through all of these principles and kind of explain why each of these exist and how each of these contribute to a more successful animation. So the first principle is the principle of squash and stretch. And you can see what's going on here. There's this bouncy cube. But this principle is establishing physics, basically the physics of mass. So the way mass behaves with gravity, with different materials, and how flexible they are. If you've ever seen a bouncing ball in slow motion, you see that when it reaches the ground, it squashes, and then it stretches when it bounces up. So this is a lot with inertia, it's a lot with changing direction, but this is basically used to establish physics in a two-dimensional animation. We also have a principle called anticipation, and this principle is used to also establish physics, basically the inertia of start and stop, because we know that an object that is in motion tends to remain in motion, and an object at rest tends to remain at rest. So it needs energy to get started, and it needs energy to stop. You can also use anticipation to add sentience. So you can see this box looks like it's got a little bit of personality, right? It's doing something. Great example is like the wind up before a pitch, or anticipation at a starting line of a race. Another principle is called staging. Now, this is not necessarily an animation principle. This can also be done just with other static elements on the page. It could be any number of things. You can use movement for this. You can use layout for this. You can just use the relationship between objects or hierarchy for this. But basically, the point of staging is just guiding the viewer to whatever the most important part of the page is. There's a couple of principles in animation called straight ahead action versus pose to pose. So straight ahead action is basically you are drawing each frame by frame, and pose to pose is where you are basically tweening, which we'll talk a little bit about later, which is basically you are laying out the important keyframes, and then you're just letting the junior animator, or in our case, the computer, figure out what the transition is supposed to be between each of those things. There's also a concept called follow-through, or overlapping action. And this is, again, a physics concept, and it's about the physics of mass and how mass behaves, differences in mass, and therefore the behavior of different elements. So in this example, this is a tall element. And so because of inertia, when the bottom part stops, the top part keeps going. And we can see this is kind of a very flexible element. It kind of feels very rubbery. So this is how that kind of mass would behave. Another great example is if I was, going to toss my hair and I had long, beautiful hair, my hair would kind of keep going more so than my face would. So my face would stop and my hair would keep going. So this is establishing the realism of how mass behaves as it starts and stops moving. The slow in and slow out concept, this is also using physics to establish mass using the concept of acceleration. In animation, we call this easing. There are some specific things that we can talk about in CSS and JavaScript about easing, but this is basically the slow in and slow out. So things don't just start and stop immediately. They accelerate and decelerate. And I have some examples later in the presentation of this specifically. There's also the concept of arcing. So again, I'm going to talk about physics a lot. I really liked physics, and physics is pretty important in animation. But objects in aerial motion, due to mass and gravity, they don't move in straight lines, but they follow an arc. So if you throw something up in midair, it's going to go up into midair, kind of slow down, and then come back down into an arc. If you shoot something out at a straight line, it's not going to just go in a straight line forever. Due to gravity, it's going to fall down in an arc. So using these arcs to make things more believable as they move through space. Secondary action is basically a supporting motion. So this is a little bit of an overlap between physics and psychology. So in physics, it's basically that attention to detail. And a great example that I like to give is in Monsters, Inc. It was a really big deal when they animated Sully because they animated each one of his hairs. And it made it much more believable to see how all of his hairs would move around in the wind or as he was moving. Even though his body might be moving, all of his hairs are moving as a secondary action. This ties into the psychological principle of believability. We know that hair moves around separately from the body, and so it just makes the character seem more present and more credible than something that just had a bunch of static hairs sitting there. Timing is another principle. So this is, again, a physics principle, and it establishes a lot of different things. So it gives you can see that these are all the same shapes, right? There's two tiny little squares and one big square. But by looking at it, we believe a lot of different things. Maybe the big square on the bottom is lighter weight. Maybe the little squares are stronger. Maybe the surface on the bottom has less friction on it. Maybe they're made of different materials. But we are establishing kind of all of these different contexts of physics just based on how we use timing. Exaggeration is another great one. Basically, this is a psychological principle that overemphasis of something actually makes it more believable. It's kind of like stage makeup, where if you saw somebody on the street wearing stage makeup, you'd be like, wow, that is a lot of makeup. But if you saw them on stage, it looks very natural because of the fact that the light blows them out, and you need to be able to see it from far away. Same kind of principle with exaggeration. Actually, adding a little bit of extra movement makes it seem more believable than being subtle. Solid drawing is basically just a concept to say that we believe that this object could actually exist in this space. It is behaving consistently with itself. It is behaving consistently with its environment. It's following the principles of space, time, and matter. It's following, where the dimensions are located. And this is, again, an overlap between physics and psychology, because we are believing that the object could physically exist in this space. It is not doing anything that breaks the laws of physics. And the last one is kind of the most subjective one, and this is a very psychological one, but it's the concept of appeal. And it's basically the personality or the heart and soul of an object. It's that thing, again, that we talked about before, adding delight, right? Adding personality. This is the concept of appeal. So these all make sense, right? But how are these useful to us? Basically, what do these things specifically provide to our animation if we are following these principles? First of all, they provide realism. So we talked a lot about physics. They establish how things behave in the real world. They help us establish context. Remember, context was something that was very important to establish with animation when we're dealing with interactions, because we are establishing spatial relationships between states, objects, and their stage. In the same vein, they also establish causality. This is really important with interactive design because we are establishing that there is an influential relationship between actions and objects. We did a thing and therefore another thing happened. That's very important in interaction. They enable us to direct focus or attention to the most important elements on the page. And again, they bring delight. They bring positive experiences and personality and things that just add that extra something to an interaction. All right, so now that we've talked a bit about philosophy, I want to talk a little bit about some practical stuff. So what are some different properties that we can animate, and in what way? So this is basically your animation vocabulary lesson as it pertains to things on the web. So there are several different elements that you can animate on the web. One of those things is color, and that could be the color of text, that could be the fill, that could be the border, but pretty much any kind of color you can animate. We can animate the location of something on a page relative to something else or relative to its container. We can animate the scale of something, so make it larger, make it smaller. We can animate the shape of something. We can transition one shape into another shape. We can animate the focus through whether it's fuzzy or sharp. And we can also animate the opacity or transparency of something, so whether or not you can see through it, whether or not it's solid. These are all different elements that we have control over in animation. And by combining these in a lot of different ways, we can create some very, very compelling interactions. I said I would talk a little bit about easing, mostly because I wanted to stare at this. This is so hypnotic to me. But there are several different kinds of easing that lead to different effects of how an element behaves on a page. So we have an ease in, and that is basically acceleration. So that is something speeding up. It starts slow and it gets faster. Conversely, we have an ease out, which is deceleration. So it starts fast and it slows down. We also have a bounce or a spring. So this is using that concept of follow through, where you're going slightly past its destination. So this, if you have something that comes in with a bounce, maybe it comes a little bit forward and then bounces back a little bit, that makes it feel like it's lighter or faster and maybe a little more personable than something that maybe slowly decelerates into the view. So that's, again, establishing mass, establishing personality, establishing speed. These are all different ways that you can use easing to add personality. I also want to talk a little bit about duration. So there was a study by Jacob Nielsen called 3 Important Time Limits. And this is basically talking about how long should something take and in what way do people interpret things. So the first time is 100 milliseconds or less. That basically feels instantaneous. So this is very good for immediate or small transitions. So these transitions right now, they're happening right around that basically instantaneous time, and they feel like I did this thing and immediately happened. For response times of up to 1 second, it still feels connected. So this is good for, and these are, this is in between the 0.1 and the 1 second. These are slightly more complicated animations. We didn't want them to take the 0.1 second, but they don't need to take 1 second. For the 1 second, this is great for navigation or major state changes. So you still feel like these things are connected. I clicked the button and something happened. But if it happened too fast, it might feel very, very jarring. So we wanted to give it time for a bunch of things to happen at once. Once we get up to 10 seconds, users have lost their train of thought and they feel disconnected. But we know that not everything is going to be able to load in 10 seconds, right? We might be able to be loading a whole bunch of content. We might be Ajaxing something. And so if you have something that's going to take closer to that 10-second mark, you want to have some intermediary animations, right? So like a progress bar or some intermediary content, some demo content, to show that, yes, something is happening, be patient, it's not nothing. So how do you choose how long something should take? If something needs to travel a greater distance or needs to be a greater size, it needs to take a longer time, right? If something is happening closer to the area of central focus, it can take less time because we're already looking at it. We don't have to spend some time being like, oh, it's over here, what? But basically, this little article that I've linked to down here, this is a really great article, and basically anything that the Nielsen group says you should just do because they're brilliant. But this is a little bit about duration. There are a few different kinds of transitions that can happen, and these are kind of the 4 basic ones. So an element can be persistent, so it can transition but still stay on the stage. It can be outgoing, so it started on the stage and then it fades away or leaves somehow. It can be incoming, where it started not on the stage and then shows up. And it can be static, which means it's not actually doing anything, but it's still a relevant element on the page. Relevant element, that was fun to say. It can still be a relevant element on the page, and everything else will be kind of animating around it. So these are the different ways things can transition onto, off of, or staying on the page. I said I'd talk a little bit about tweening. So when all of these animatable elements transition between each other, the ones we talked about before, color, shape, transparency, and focus, all of these things, that's called a tween. That is transitioning between the keyframes. And you can see that this particular element, this is a pretty common interaction, maybe a menu button at the corner of something that animates into a modal. Lots of different things we're tweening here. So we're tweening shape, we're tweening scale, we're tweening color, we're tweening transparency because you can see the background has this overlay going over it. So lots of things are tweening here together to create an interaction that makes a lot of sense together. There are also several different kinds of fades that we can have. There's a dissolve or a standard fade where something just fades out. There's a cross dissolve or a simultaneous fade where something is fading out as something is fading in. And there's also a fast through, which is basically where something fades out and then something fades in. That's also called a sequential fade. So there's a little bit of a difference between the cross dissolve, where there is an intermediary state where you can see both things at once. Whereas with a sequential fade, something will fade out and something will fade back in. They don't actually overlap at any given point. And then there's transformation. And this one, especially the one on the left-hand side there, that reminds me of like my early days in Flash. So for any of you that ever did Flash and started playing with tweening, and you ever did like a keyframe tween, and you're like, oh my gosh, look at this cool thing that the computer is doing for me. That reminds me of that. But transformation can be used to do a lot of useful things. I really like the example of the animation on the right with the submit button, where it turns into the progress indicator and then turns into the success indicator. That's a pretty cool example of transformation, communicating useful information for an interaction. So this website called UX in Motion developed some specific uses of motion patterns. These are not the same thing as the principles of animation. They basically created some specific ones that can be used in web design, and some of them you might recognize. I'm just going to leave this up here for a little bit for you to stare at it, but I'm not going to go into detail about these. You can go to uxinmotion.net and read a little bit more about it yourself. What I did want to do here, though, is talk a little bit about some practical stuff. So there are several different ways that you can animate for the web, one of which is through CSS by itself, especially modern CSS. And one of those is through JavaScript, which is why I'm here talking at this conference. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we animate for the web and what all of those things are. So the first thing I wanted to go into, if you weren't familiar with CSS Animations specifically, this is via Mozilla. So I've got links to all of this stuff at the ending slides, and I'll be sharing all that. So don't feel like you have to read all this now. This is a bunch of words on a page stuff. But basically, Mozilla is saying that there's a couple different types of CSS animation. So there are CSS transitions, which provide an easy way to make animations occur between the current style and an end style. So basically, if you're transitioning between a current state and a hover state or something like that. And you can change the timing of those things. You can change the easing of those things. You're basically transitioning between two specific styles. CSS animations are not only are animating the style, but there's also keyframes involved. So again, if you've ever done any traditional animation in like Flash or a similar program, you know that keyframes are basically all of these transitional states in between. You can do some of that inside of CSS animations. So you have not only the styles, but also keyframes, so when those styles are going to change. There are several different properties that you can animate in CSS. Layout properties determine the size and placement of page elements. These are they're pretty heavy. You don't really want to be animating these necessarily. They're pretty heavy. If you're changing the width and height of other page elements, you can do some unpredictable stuff to your layout, and they're pretty heavy performance-wise. So if you can avoid animating them via CSS, do so. There are also paint properties. These are things that are defining the appearance of elements on a page. Depending on the size and complexity of your element, this can be very costly from a performance standpoint. But if they're very small elements or don't require a lot of space, it might be all right to be animating paint properties. A lot of people recommend mostly animating composite properties. And these are things like position, scale, rotation, and opacity. So these are things that don't necessarily trigger paint or layout changes. And these transforms are things that they would recommend animating. And I have a link to an informative article that talks a lot more about performance in that respect. So CSS tricks, basically we're talking about like what are the capabilities of JavaScript animation versus CSS animation. Basically, the more complex you want your animation to be, the more likely it is that JavaScript is going to be a better solution for you. You can, transform things independently. You can give things relative values rather than absolute values. You can nest things. You can do things based on progress. You can add controls to things. Another aspect of that is that if you have to support much older browsers, a lot of modern CSS animations don't work in them. However, something that they did mention was that there is a graceful degradation of no transition as opposed to having to run a bunch of things to detect stuff or throwing an error that JavaScript might do if it is a version that doesn't support older browsers. Performance-wise, though, the next thing, this is basically the question that everybody has, like, which is more performant? Is it JavaScript? Is it CSS? And basically, the synopsis that I got, both from CSS Tricks and from Hacker Noon, is it depends, but that the all of it beat out using jQuery. So jQuery was kind of the early stage of using JavaScript to easily animate things online. A lot of people were using the jQuery animation libraries. Both vanilla JavaScript and CSS outperform jQuery by far. But it kind of depended on what you were doing, whether JavaScript or CSS performed better. So the synopsis that I had from what I was reading here is that JavaScript performed better when it was affecting document flow. So again, that stuff about reanimating page layout and stuff, it was better to use JavaScript for this than it was to use straight CSS from a performance perspective. JavaScript also performed better the closer you got to vanilla JavaScript and you weren't loading a whole bunch of other additional libraries. So again, the more resources you're loading, makes sense, the less performant it will be. CSS did perform better on certain devices than JavaScript did, which was kind of interesting. And it was really great for basic transitions. So again, hover states and stuff like that, or some of the basic transforms that we talked about earlier. And it actually seemed to handle 3D transforms better than JavaScript did, according to these sources. Also, they wanted to mention CSS is more resilient. Errors in CSS won't throw everything off the same way that JavaScript will. It will just not work. And again, like I said, both of them beat out jQuery in performance testing. So if we are going to be using animation, jQuery animation is probably not the most performant way that you can do things. Now, obviously, with WordPress specifically, if you're using WordPress the way it comes, it is already loading jQuery. So if you already have it there, it might be useful, but you don't necessarily have to be using jQuery with WordPress. And so you can think about that if performance is extremely important to you. I will disclaimer, performance and all of this stuff is not necessarily my forte. I am a front-end developer, but I wouldn't say that going into complex JavaScript and animation is the thing that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. I'm doing a lot more subtle interactive design, more so than complicated high-end stuff that requires a lot of major performance stuff. So if you have performance-specific questions about any of this stuff, I would recommend reading the links to the articles that I'm going to share at the end of this presentation, and also maybe speaking to some people that are working more heavily in those libraries. But this is basically my synopsis of what I've been reading about. So the conclusion, because this is what the question is, when should I use CSS and when should I use JavaScript? Google developers says use CSS when you have smaller self-contained states for UI elements. So again, stuff like navigation menus or tooltips or hovers. This is a lot of the stuff that I'm doing. So I do use JavaScript to control the states or to add and remove classes. So for example, if I'm building a sticky header, I might use JavaScript to add and remove a class based on where something is and on the page, and add some timeouts and stuff for that so that it's not running constantly. But the actual state changes, the actual style changes, the actual height changes, all of that stuff is happening within my CSS, and the transition is happening within my CSS. And all I'm using JavaScript for in that case is to just add and remove classes based on the conditions. And Google says to use JavaScript, basically if you need significant control over your animations. JavaScript can do a lot more complicated things than CSS can. CSS is great for very straightforward animation, and it can actually do some really cool stuff too. But if you need some very, very specific and dialed in control over your animations, JavaScript is probably the way to go. But again, we still have to be thinking about how we use animation. So animation can do a lot of great things. It can provide a lot of useful context for your interactions. It can let people know when things are complete. It can show people where things come from. But either way, adding animation is adding complexity, and we want to make sure that we are using our animation responsibly. So there are a series of questions that you could be asking yourself when you're thinking about, should I use animation? First of all, does it add value? You want to prioritize animations that will add value or multiple forms of value. So what do I mean by that? Does it show the user where information came from or where it went to? That's pretty useful. Does it indicate progress? Is it showing that something is happening? Does it move the user through an information space? Is it reinforcing the physics of an item? Is it reinforcing the personality of your brand? Is it adding delight in some way? Is it doing something specific? Does it explain something faster than words or a video could? Sometimes just having a little arrow pointing at something and back and forth is faster than having explanatory text saying, hey, don't forget to click on this thing. Are your behaviors consistent? It is a better user experience to adopt consistent animation patterns. So if something animates one way in one place, it will also animate the same way in another place. You want something to behave as expected. But it also gives you a more streamlined and maintainable code base if you're reusing animation components a bunch of places rather than having to build bespoke things that has to reload and reload every single time you go somewhere different. So this is great for your users and for your code base. Is it still functional without it? So we want to offer an alternative or a fallback. We don't want to make it mission critical, especially if you're doing some cutting edge CSS or JavaScript stuff. You do want your actions to still be functional without the animation. So you do want your form to still submit. You do still want a menu to be able to be accessible, even if it doesn't animate. So the animation is providing useful context, it's making it better, but we do still want it to be functional, even if the animation does not work. Is your animation optimized? So when you're animating something, again, this is a performance question, but you do want to think about the complexity of the objects that you're animating. If it's an SVG, how many paths are we animating? What are we animating? Are we repainting something? Are we resizing something? Are we moving other things around? How many things are we moving? How many things need to re-render? Is it something like a vector, or is this a photo? What are we animating, and is this as optimized as we can make it? And kind of the final question is, do you actually need it? Or is it just something that you think would be nice because it would be nice? Don't do it if you don't need it. Don't load extra resources. Don't place any extra cognitive load on people if it's not going to actually be useful. I read a really great quote in Animation at Work. Don't make something unless it is both necessary and useful. But if it is both necessary and useful, don't hesitate to make it beautiful. And the way that I think about that is basically be pragmatic first, right? But if we did decide that it's something you need, do it purposefully and do it well. All right, so I've got a giant barf of links here. Again, I'm going to be sharing links to these slides afterwards, so you'll be able to access all of these. All of these links on this page are stuff about animation design in general and interface design in general. There's access to this first one is all of the 12 principles of animation as done in CSS, which is kind of cool. But these are basically about the user interface and user experience design of animation. The second page of links here is a bunch of practical resources, a lot about the performance issues and stuff that I cited earlier. The first one is pretty cool. It's an entire animation handbook that was put out by InVision, who does a lot of prototyping, and so they know a couple things about interaction design. CSS triggers is pretty cool because it's basically all of the different trigger states that you can animate. It's pretty neat. That is the end of the formal part of my presentation, so I'll be able to do Q&A and talking and stuff. But here's basically how to get in touch with me. I am Marktime Media all over the internet. This is my personal site, michelleschulp.pink, which is pretty easy to remember. But it is where I sometimes blog, but I basically collect all of my stuff there. I keep all my talks there. This is actually the link to the old version of my talk that I gave that doesn't have all of the JavaScript and CSS specific stuff in it that I put together just for y'all. So I will get a more up-to-date link that I will be able to share later. After this, though, I'll obviously be hanging out to answer some questions right now. You could find me online at lots of podcasts. So if you have one and you need a guest, I'm always happy to talk about stuff. Otherwise, in person, I'm going to be going to a bunch of events coming up at the end of the summer and into the fall. So these are some of the ones that I'm going to be at, several WordCamps. and Pressnomics as well. But yeah, that is basically me and where I'll be at. I have a question about best places to learn transitions and animations. So a couple of the links that are in the slides, and again, I will share the link. I will get an up-to-date link out after I'm done talking here, because I need to upload the new slides that have all the new information. But a lot of those links at the end of my presentation have they have some really good, useful stuff about transitions, animations, and how CSS works and stuff. But honestly, for me, the place that I learned it was just like playing around with it. I mean, CSS Tricks has infinite resources. There's several different really cool people. Val Head is a really awesome woman that I've heard speak about animation several times, and her stuff is very informative as well. So.
But did you cover suggestions for choosing between different easings?
Ooh, I didn't specifically, but basically, if we're talking about something leaving a page, you'd usually want to have it start slow and end fast, right? Like it would accelerate out. That makes sense because it's starting from the stop and then it's accelerating as it. Whereas if it's coming into a page, you could either have it decelerate in. Or you can have it kind of do a bounce in, so it's kind of coming in fast and then bounces to a stop. Those are a couple different options, but that's looking into kind of like physics principles, right? So how would I expect an object to behave if it was real and it was actually showing up? Those are kind of best ways to think about it.
All right. Well, then in that case, we've got a 15-minute break before the next session. And thank you so much, Michelle. And we'll see you all at the top of the hour.
Awesome.